Between 1903 and 1924, over 800 children were sent to the Robertson Relocation Camp in the remote plains of western Nebraska. They were orphans, delinquents, children of immigrants, and those deemed feeble-minded by the standards of the era. They were America's unwanted children, sent to be reformed and rehabilitated. Not a single child ever returned. Official records claim they were successfully relocated to new homes, transferred to other institutions, or had integrated into society. Yet when families inquired about their whereabouts, they received only vague, contradictory explanations. No addresses, no forwarding contacts, just administrative assurances that the children had been successfully processed. Year after year, children vanished into the Robertson facility, their names eventually reduced to fading ink on dusty ledgers. Their fates a mystery that powerful people wanted buried forever. Tonight we unearth one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. A story of systematic cruelty conducted under the guise of social reform. A horrifying truth that challenges our understanding of what supposedly civilized people are capable of when they view certain lives as expendable. If you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of our nation's development, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by the familiar demons of American history, not racial hatred, religious fanaticism, or even profit. The Robertson camp represents something far more terrifying: the calculated pursuit of human improvement at any cost. The belief that certain children were mere raw material for a grand experiment in social engineering. This was eugenics, not in theory, but in its most brutal application. To understand how such atrocities could remain hidden for decades, we must first understand where they occurred. The Robertson Relocation Camp was deliberately positioned in one of America's most isolated regions, a desolate stretch of Nebraska plains, 15 miles from the nearest settlement of White Clay, itself barely a town with fewer than 100 residents. The facility was erected in 1903 on 2,000 acres of windswept grassland. The nearest railroad station was 27 miles away. The only access was via a single dirt road that became impassable during winter storms and spring rains, isolating the compound for weeks at a time. The architecture itself speaks volumes about the facility's true purpose. Surviving blueprints reveal a compound designed not for rehabilitation, but for containment and concealment. The main structure resembled a fortress more than a school. 3 stories of imposing red brick with narrow windows positioned too high for children to see out or be seen from outside. A 15-foot stone wall surrounded the entire compound, topped with barbed wire that contemporary accounts note was positioned to keep people in rather than out. Guard towers occupied each corner, ostensibly to prevent escapes by troubled youth, though local contractors who built the facility reported that the towers were designed with inward-facing searchlights. Most telling were the features absent from official blueprints but discovered in archaeological excavations conducted in 1978. Beneath the main building extended 3 subterranean levels, accessible only through a heavily secured elevator and stairwell. These underground chambers contained what appeared to be laboratory spaces, isolation cells, and most disturbing of all, a crematorium with capacity far exceeding what would be needed for normal mortuary purposes. The early 1900s marked the height of America's progressive era, a period of social activism and political reform. But alongside genuine humanitarian efforts ran a darker current of thought: eugenics, the pseudoscience of improving humanity through controlled breeding and the elimination of undesirable traits. While most Americans today associate eugenics with Nazi Germany, the movement actually found its earliest and most enthusiastic embrace in the United States. By 1910, eugenics was taught in 376 American universities and colleges. Prominent families like the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Harrimans provided substantial funding for eugenics research. Eugenicists divided humanity into fit and unfit categories. The unfit included those with physical disabilities, cognitive impairments, those deemed morally defective, and often children of recent immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, who were considered genetically inferior to earlier Northern European settlers. The most visible manifestation of eugenic thinking was the wave of forced sterilization laws enacted across America. By 1931, 30 states had passed legislation allowing the compulsory sterilization of those deemed socially inadequate. Over 64,000 Americans were legally sterilized under these programs, with California leading the nation at over 20,000 procedures. But sterilization was merely the public face of eugenics. Behind closed doors, more ambitious and horrifying experiments were being conducted, experiments requiring human subjects who wouldn't be missed. Children labeled as feeble-minded, incorrigible, or morally defective provided the perfect test subjects. With minimal legal protections and often no family advocates, these children could be subjected to extended treatments without outside interference. Institutional facilities like the Robertson Camp operated in a legal gray zone, granted extraordinary authority over their charges with virtually no oversight. The term relocation camp itself was a euphemism designed to obscure the facility's true purpose. Parents who surrendered their children to Robertson were told they were sending them to a progressive institution where troublesome youth would receive education, discipline, and eventual placement in suitable homes or occupations. What they couldn't know was that their children were entering a living laboratory from which they would never emerge. At the center of this dark chapter stands the enigmatic figure of Jeremiah Robertson, the camp's founder and director from 1903 until its closure in 1924. Born in Boston in 1862 to a wealthy family with shipping interests, Robertson was educated at Harvard, where he studied both medicine and law without completing either degree. Contemporary accounts describe him as a charismatic figure with penetrating eyes and the bearing of a natural aristocrat. He moved in elite social circles, cultivating connections with industrialists, politicians, and academic figures, particularly those involved in the burgeoning eugenics movement. Robertson's public persona was that of a benevolent reformer dedicated to solving what he called the problem of defective youth. In speeches and articles, he projected an image of stern but compassionate authority, speaking eloquently about reclaiming the lost and preparing damaged children for a productive future. In an 1899 article published in the American Journal of Social Hygiene, Robertson wrote, "The degenerate child, if properly redirected during the formative years, may yet be salvaged for productive citizenship. Those beyond redemption must be prevented from contaminating future generations with their defects. Mercy sometimes requires difficult choices." This seemingly compassionate rhetoric masked Robertson's true beliefs, revealed in his private correspondence with fellow eugenicists. In these letters, discovered in 1972 in a sealed vault in his former Boston residence, Robertson described children with disabilities or behavioral problems as human waste and evolutionary dead ends, who should be processed rather than reformed. Most chilling was his 1901 letter to Charles Davenport, director of the Eugenics Record Office, in which Robertson outlined his vision for the Nebraska facility. The beauty of isolated institutional care is that it allows for extended observation and intervention without sentimental interference. Subjects who prove unsuitable for conventional rehabilitation may still serve humanity through their contribution to scientific understanding. Equally important to the Robertson operation was Matron Elara Vance, who served as head administrator from the camp's opening day. Vance, a registered nurse with additional training in psychiatry, had previously worked at the notorious Blackwell's Island Asylum in New York, where she developed a reputation for strict discipline and innovative treatments for female patients. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with prematurely white hair pulled into a tight bun, Vance was described by the few staff who later testified as terrifying in her efficiency and devoid of normal human warmth. Former kitchen worker Clara Simmons recalled, "When children cried, she would watch them with curiosity, like someone studying an insect. I never once saw her offer comfort." Vance maintained meticulous records of every child who entered Robertson, documenting physical measurements, behavioral observations, and family background with scientific precision. Her logbooks, partially recovered during the 1978 excavation, reveal a disturbing preoccupation with cataloging physical abnormalities and defects, from minor asymmetries of facial features to detailed notes on skull measurements. Her background in nursing and psychiatry was supplemented by a deep interest in phrenology and other pseudoscientific methods of classifying human types. Vance believed fervently in the concept of degenerate bloodlines and viewed most of the children under her care as living examples of genetic failure. In her private notes, Vance developed an elaborate classification system for the children, ranging from potentially salvageable to specimen quality. This last category, investigators would later discover, referred to children selected for the most invasive experimental procedures, those whose bodies would be preserved for scientific study rather than returned to society. The third key figure in the Robertson triumvirate was Dr. Silas Blackwood, who held the title of medical consultant from 1904 until 1924. Unlike Robertson and Vance, Blackwood maintained a carefully low profile, rarely appearing in official photographs or documents. His name appears on the facility's payroll records, but he seems to have taken great care to minimize documentation of his specific activities. What little we know of Blackwood comes primarily from his previous positions. He received medical training at Johns Hopkins University, specializing in neurology. From 1896 to 1903, he worked at the Pennsylvania Training School for Feeble-Minded Children, where he conducted controversial research on brain development in children with cognitive disabilities. Blackwood published several papers in obscure medical journals, focusing on what he called surgical interventions for behavioral modification. These papers, though vague in their methodology, suggested that targeted damage to specific brain regions could correct certain behavioral problems in children. Former staff later testified that Blackwood maintained a separate facility within the underground levels of Robertson, a space referred to as the treatment rooms that only specifically authorized personnel could enter. Children who were taken to these rooms were rarely seen again, and those who did return were described as empty-eyed and changed in fundamental ways. Blackwood's interest in human potential and social engineering aligned perfectly with Robertson's eugenics vision and Vance's clinical detachment. Together, they created a triumvirate of pseudoscientific authority that operated without meaningful oversight for over 2 decades. What made these three individuals particularly dangerous was their combination of scientific knowledge, social connections, and complete moral detachment. They operated within a historical context that valued order and efficiency above individual rights, particularly when those individuals were deemed defective by the standards of the time. They were not raving lunatics or obvious monsters, but respected professionals working within the mainstream scientific thinking of their era. Their credentials and connections shielded them from scrutiny, while their isolation allowed them to push the boundaries of what even fellow eugenicists considered acceptable research. As one survivor would later testify, they didn't seem evil. That was the most frightening part. They acted like doctors treating a disease, but the disease they were treating was our existence. With these three at the helm, the Robertson Relocation Camp operated not as a rehabilitation center, but as a laboratory where children deemed undesirable by society could be subjected to increasingly horrific experiments in behavioral modification, eugenic research, and ultimately systematic elimination. The question that haunts historians to this day is not just how these three individuals could commit such atrocities, but how American society created the conditions that allowed their work to continue unquestioned for over 20 years. The first serious concerns about Robertson Camp emerged in 1908 when Edward Blackburn, a Department of Child Welfare inspector, arrived for what should have been a routine assessment. He stayed 6 days. His official report contained carefully worded observations that hinted at profound unease. The facility maintains exceptional cleanliness and order, perhaps too exceptional, given the nature of its residents. The children display unusual quietness and uniformity of behavior. Most troubling was his observation about the numbers. Records indicate 147 children currently in residence, yet despite multiple complete tours, I was unable to visually account for more than 83 at any time. In his private journal, discovered after his death, Blackburn wrote more candidly, "Something deeply wrong at Robertson. The children's eyes, empty, like dolls. No spontaneity. They move like automatons." He described hearing a child screaming, then abrupt silence from a restricted basement area. When he inquired, he was told a dental procedure was in progress. Despite these concerns, Blackburn's official report ultimately approved the facility's continued operation. 3 months later, he resigned his position, sold his home, and disappeared from public life. More damning testimony came from Maria Diaz, a kitchen worker who fled the camp in 1910. Her sworn statement to Denver police described disturbing patterns. New children arrived every week, but the total number never seemed to increase. When I asked where the others had gone, I was told they had been graduated or transferred, but there were never any graduation ceremonies, never any visible departures. As a kitchen worker, Diaz was responsible for preparing meals for what the official roster listed as 172 children. But we never served more than 90 meals at any time, she testified. When she questioned this discrepancy, she was told many children were on restricted diets as part of their treatment. Her most chilling testimony concerned what she witnessed one November night. Through the window facing the rear of the property, I saw Matron Vance and two attendants carrying what appeared to be a small body wrapped in sheets. They took it to the far corner where a pit had been dug. The next morning, Director Robertson announced that a child named Thomas had been transferred to California due to his excellent progress. Denver police forwarded her testimony to Nebraska authorities, but no investigation followed. Records show that Director Robertson had powerful political connections. An internal review dismissed Diaz as an unreliable foreign national with possible mental instabilities. Between 1908 and 1916, at least 7 former employees attempted to report concerns. None of their complaints resulted in formal investigations. 3 whistleblowers were later committed to psychiatric institutions. 2 others died under circumstances ruled accidental but containing troubling inconsistencies. The remote location, political protection, and society's indifference to institutionalized children created perfect conditions for the horrors occurring behind Robertson's walls. The truth remained hidden until October 1924, when a flood of the Niobrara River forced an emergency evacuation. In the chaos, county officials and volunteers entered the compound without warning. What they discovered in the basement levels would fundamentally change our understanding of America's eugenics movement. The first sublevel contained standard medical facilities. The second revealed something far more disturbing: a fully equipped research laboratory with technology far beyond what any children's reformatory would need. Sheriff James Harrington described the third sublevel as a surgical theater one might find at a medical university, but with modifications that suggest purposes no legitimate hospital would condone. Specialized restraint systems are built into examination tables. Devices for measuring physiological responses are connected to what can only be described as containment cells. Most disturbing was the observation ward, a circular room with glass-walled cells arranged around a central surgical area. Each cell contained a narrow bed with restraints and monitoring equipment. The central area held a sophisticated operating table, surrounded by recording devices and specialized tools for brain surgery. When officials recovered the research logs kept in fireproof safes, the true horror emerged. Robertson Camp was not primarily a reformatory, but America's most ambitious eugenic research facility, where unwanted children served as involuntary test subjects in neurological experiments. Dr. Silas Blackwood's journals documented hundreds of procedures performed on children between ages 4 and 16. The earliest entries described crude attempts at behavior modification through surgical intervention, deliberately damaging specific brain regions to eliminate undesirable traits, such as disobedience or excessive independence. A typical entry reads, Subject 37, male age 8, admitted for chronic disobedience. First cranial procedure performed targeting the prefrontal region, results initially promising. Subject showed marked decrease in aggressive behaviors but retained basic functions. By day 14, subject displayed concerning loss of speech capacity and developed seizures. As years progressed, Blackwood's techniques became more sophisticated. By 1912, he had developed what he called behavioral sculpting, precisely targeted surgical damage to specific brain regions, combined with chemical treatments and psychological conditioning. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of the graduation protocol. Children who had been subjected to multiple procedures and were no longer useful, either because experiments had succeeded in destroying targeted brain functions or because their condition had deteriorated too severely, were graduated through a final, invariably fatal procedure. Blackwood's notes describe this process with disturbing detachment. Terminal studies provide invaluable data unavailable through other means. Complete anatomical examination post-procedure allows for precise correlation between interventions and neural outcomes. The remains of these graduated children were discovered in mass graves on the facility's northern boundary, an area designated on official maps as future agricultural development. Forensic examination recovered the remains of at least 268 children, with evidence suggesting many more had been cremated after valuable specimens had been preserved. Children selected for graduation were those whose continued existence would complicate operations, those who had begun to recover memories of procedures, those who showed visible evidence of experimentation, or those who demonstrated resistance to conditioning despite multiple interventions. When investigators began examining the documents recovered from Robertson Camp, they discovered evidence of a program far more extensive and organized than initially suspected. The facility operated not as an isolated aberration, but as the centerpiece of a network dedicated to advancing eugenic principles through human experimentation. The most damning evidence came from Robertson's hidden vault, containing correspondence with prominent scientists, politicians, and academics who had supported the camp's research. These documents revealed that knowledge of the experiments had spread through elite circles across America and Europe. Robertson's personal manifesto, a 200-page document titled The Reconstruction of Humanity, outlined his vision for applying the techniques developed at Robertson Camp nationwide. He advocated for mandatory screening of all children at age 5, with those showing defective tendencies to be removed for corrective intervention at specialized facilities. The surgical and chemical protocols we have perfected, he wrote, provide the first practical method for addressing degeneracy at its neurological source. A single generation of systematic intervention would eliminate the majority of antisocial behaviors that plague our civilization. More chilling was his implementation plan, which proposed establishing 20 optimization centers across the United States, each processing 500 children annually. Robertson had already identified locations, approached wealthy donors, and drafted legislation that would authorize mandatory screening and treatment of children deemed problematic. Matron Vance's records proved equally disturbing. Her logs tracked every child who entered Robertson Camp, categorizing them by research value and documenting their progress through various experimental protocols. The clinical precision revealed a mind that viewed children not as human beings, but as research material. Her private journal revealed she had developed a system for identifying children with traits desired for different experimental protocols. She maintained correspondence with orphanages across 12 states, providing financial incentives for sending children who matched her requirements. Dr. Blackwood's research notes provided the scientific backbone of the operation. Thousands of pages documented his systematic experiments in behavioral modification through targeted neurological intervention, a clinical euphemism for deliberately damaging children's brains to eliminate unwanted behaviors. His early work focused on crude surgical approaches. Later experiments became more refined, using electrical stimulation to map brain functions before making precise lesions. By 1920, he had developed techniques for accessing deep brain structures without killing the subject, allowing for more subtle adjustments to personality. One series of experiments focused on what Blackwood called emotional recalibration, procedures targeting the brain's limbic system to eliminate certain emotional responses while preserving others. The goal was to retain positive emotions conducive to social harmony, gratitude, contentment, desire to please, while eliminating troublesome emotions such as anger, defiance, and excessive attachment. The results described children whose emotional responses had been surgically altered to create compliant, docile individuals. Subject shows appropriate positive responses to authority figures, read one observation, but no longer displays emotional distress when separated from attachment figures. Fear response remains intact when directly threatened, but anger response has been successfully eliminated. Beyond personal records, investigators discovered evidence of wider complicity. Financial ledgers revealed funding from prominent American industrialists and foundations. Correspondence showed that Blackwood maintained regular communication with researchers at prestigious medical schools, sharing sanitized data and receiving suggestions for new research directions. The physical evidence was equally damning. Investigators discovered specialized restraint systems for children of various ages, custom-built equipment for manipulating the brain while subjects remained conscious, and an elaborate system for recording behavioral responses. A climate-controlled vault contained over 200 preserved human brains, most from children between ages 6 and 14. Each was meticulously labeled with a subject number corresponding to Blackwood's records, allowing for precise correlation between specific procedures and their anatomical effects. Forensic teams examining the grounds discovered multiple burial sites containing the remains of at least 300 children. Evidence suggested that in later years, Robertson had instituted a policy of cremating most graduated subjects, preserving only those body parts with continuing research value. What made the evidence particularly chilling was the contrast between the clinical, dispassionate language used in documents and the unspeakable suffering they described. Children were never referred to by name, only by subject numbers. Procedures that caused excruciating pain were described only in terms of their research value. Deaths were recorded as terminal data points, providing valuable comparative information. In essence, Robertson Camp represented the darkest possible application of eugenic principles, not merely the segregation of undesirable populations, but their active use as involuntary research subjects in experiments designed to advance human improvement through surgical intervention. The Robertson Camp might have continued operating indefinitely if not for the courage of one woman. Nurse Elizabeth Winters arrived at the facility in March 1924, hired to assist in what was described as the Special Care Ward, a euphemism for the post-procedure recovery area where children were monitored after undergoing experimental surgeries. Unlike most staff who were hired locally with minimal qualifications, Winters was a fully trained surgical nurse with experience at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She had been specifically recruited by Dr. Blackwood, who needed someone with advanced skills to assist with increasingly complex procedures. What Blackwood didn't know was that Winters had a purpose beyond employment. Her younger brother had been sent to Robertson in 1916 at age 9 for behavioral correction after multiple expulsions from school. The family received 3 letters over the following 6 months, each increasingly vague about his progress. Then all communication ceased. Official inquiries were met with claims that he had been transferred to a specialized facility in Colorado. But no records of such a transfer existed. Winters spent 7 years investigating her brother's disappearance, eventually connecting with other families who had lost children to Robertson. Using forged credentials and recommendations, she secured the nursing position, determined to discover the truth from within. Her first weeks at the facility confirmed her worst fears. While ostensibly assigned to the main floor infirmary, she quickly observed the pattern of children being taken to the restricted lower levels and returning, if they returned at all, fundamentally changed. Some came back unable to speak, others with partial paralysis, all with the same vacant expression that staff called the Robertson look. Winters kept detailed notes, hiding her documentation in a hollowed-out medical text. She created coded maps of the facility, recorded staff conversations, and most crucially began collecting copies of internal documents, requisition forms, procedure logs, and transfer orders that contained damning evidence of the camp's true operations. After 4 months of gathering evidence, Winters faced a critical decision when she was finally granted access to the restricted levels. Her nursing skills had impressed Blackwood, who invited her to assist with what he called a significant advancement in the protocol, a procedure scheduled for July 16, 1924. What she witnessed that day broke through any professional detachment she had maintained. A 10-year-old girl, identified only as Subject 734, was subjected to what Blackwood called complete emotional recalibration, a procedure that involved systematic damage to multiple brain regions while the child remained partially conscious, responding to questions and commands throughout the ordeal. They had removed part of her skull, Winters later testified. Dr. Blackwood was inserting instruments into different areas of her exposed brain, asking her questions after each manipulation. When he touched certain areas, she would become confused, forgetting her own name. When he stimulated others, her emotional responses would change instantly, from terror to blank calmness. They were literally mapping her brain, region by region, identifying which areas to destroy to create the personality they wanted. That night, Winters gathered her most critical evidence and fled the facility. She traveled first to Lincoln, attempting to present her findings to state authorities, but was dismissed as hysterical. Undeterred, she made her way to Chicago, where she contacted the newly formed Child Welfare League of America. Grace Abbott, a pioneering child welfare advocate who headed the U.S. Children's Bureau, recognized the credibility of Winters' evidence and the horrific implications of her testimony. Abbott used her federal position to launch an immediate investigation, bypassing the state officials who had previously ignored similar reports. When federal agents arrived at Robertson Camp on September the 17th, 1924, they found the facility in full operation. Director Robertson, believing his political protections remained intact, allowed them entry, a miscalculation that would finally expose 2 decades of atrocities. The timing of the raid proved fortunate, occurring just weeks before the Niobrara River flood that would have likely allowed staff to destroy evidence during evacuation. Federal agents secured the facility's records, sealed the underground levels, and began the painstaking process of identifying victims and documenting crimes. The investigation faced immediate resistance from powerful interests. Senator William Phillips of Nebraska, a longtime Robertson supporter, attempted to have the investigation classified as a state matter outside federal jurisdiction. Pressure came from unexpected quarters as well. Several major universities whose researchers had corresponded with Blackwood sought to have his records sealed as protected scientific communications. These efforts at suppression failed when journalists from the Chicago Tribune and New York Times gained access to portions of Elizabeth Winters' evidence. The resulting front-page stories, House of Horrors on the Plains, and Children Butchered in Nebraska Camp, created a public outcry that made further cover-up impossible. When the full investigation concluded in February 1925, federal prosecutors announced their intention to pursue charges of kidnapping, criminal medical experimentation, and murder against Robertson, Vance, Blackwood, and 17 other staff members. They would never get the chance. On the night before the first arrests were to be made, Robertson Camp burned to the ground in a fire that investigators later determined was deliberately set. The blaze was so intense that it destroyed much of the physical evidence still at the site. More suspicious still, the 3 principal architects of the atrocities, Robertson, Vance, and Blackwood, had vanished. A nationwide manhunt yielded nothing. Despite circulating photographs to police departments across the country and offering substantial rewards, no confirmed sightings of the 3 were ever reported. International inquiries through diplomatic channels proved equally fruitless. The most credible theory, based on financial records discovered during the investigation, suggested they had fled to Argentina, where several prominent Nazis would later find refuge after World War II. Banking records showed that Robertson had transferred substantial funds to Buenos Aires in the months before the camp's exposure. While the principals escaped justice, 17 staff members were eventually convicted of crimes ranging from child endangerment to second-degree murder. The sentences, ranging from 10 years to life imprisonment, provided little consolation to the families of victims, most of whom would never know exactly what had happened to their children. The legacy of Robertson Camp extends far beyond the immediate horror of its operations. The investigation uncovered a disturbing network of connections between the camp and mainstream institutions, connections that many powerful individuals worked desperately to conceal. In the months following the exposure, several suspicious deaths occurred among those connected to the case. Dr. Lawrence Miller, a psychiatrist who had examined camp records and was preparing expert testimony, died in an apparent suicide, though his family reported he had no history of depression. 2 federal agents involved in the investigation were killed in separate automobile accidents within weeks of each other. Elizabeth Winters herself narrowly escaped an abduction attempt in Chicago, after which federal authorities placed her in protective custody. More systematic efforts at suppression soon followed. In March 1925, a fire destroyed the Chicago Federal Building Room where key evidence was being stored. In July, a special congressional committee was formed, ostensibly to investigate the Robertson matter fully, but internal memos revealed its actual purpose was to contain potential damage to national institutions. By 1926, the Robertson Camp case was being actively minimized in official channels. The final congressional report, released in December of that year, acknowledged serious improprieties at the facility, but focused primarily on administrative failures, rather than the systematic atrocities revealed by the investigation. The report made no mention of the broader network of academic and political support that had enabled the camp's operations. Most disturbing was the fate of the research itself. While publicly denouncing the Robertson experiments as criminal, several government agencies quietly preserved Blackwood's data for potential future use. Classified documents declassified in 1994 reveal that portions of his research on behavioral modification through neurological intervention were incorporated into military and intelligence programs, developing interrogation and mind control techniques. Operation Bluebird, a CIA program initiated in 1951, contained direct references to Blackwood's findings on emotional suppression through targeted neurological disruption. MKULTRA, the infamous mind control program run from 1953 to 1973, included experimental approaches derived directly from Robertson Camp methodologies, though applied through chemical rather than surgical means. The human cost of the Robertson atrocities can never be fully calculated. Of the 823 children documented to have entered the facility, only 157 were confirmed to have left alive. Most of these survivors suffered permanent physical and psychological damage. The remaining 666 children either died during experimental procedures, were graduated through the fatal protocol, or were among the unidentified remains discovered in the mass graves. The ripple effects extended to thousands more: parents who never learned their children's fate, siblings who grew up with the unexplained absence of a brother or sister, communities that lost a generation of their most vulnerable members. Beyond these immediate victims, the Robertson case raises profound questions about institutional complicity and atrocity. The camp did not operate in isolation, but within a network of academic, political, and scientific support that chose to look the other way, or worse, to actively benefit from research they knew was being conducted through unconscionable means. The eugenics movement that provided the intellectual framework for Robertson's experiments didn't die with the camp's exposure. It merely became more cautious, more careful about its public image. The same theories about improving humanity through the elimination of defective individuals continued to influence American policy for decades, from forced sterilization programs that continued into the 1970s to immigration restrictions based on eugenic principles. Perhaps most troubling is how easily the Robertson Camp story was erased from our national consciousness. Despite being featured in national headlines in 1924 and 1925, the case rapidly disappeared from public discourse. No major historical textbooks mention it. No memorials mark the site where hundreds of children were sacrificed to pseudoscientific ambition. Until the partial declassification of records in the 1990s, the entire episode had been effectively expunged from American history. This pattern of institutional forgetting raises disturbing questions. How many other atrocities lie buried in our national past, systematically erased because they implicate respected institutions or challenge our preferred national narrative? What other horrors have been classified, minimized, or simply denied until all direct witnesses are dead? The story of Robertson Camp forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. It demonstrates how scientific language and progressive rhetoric can be used to mask unconscionable cruelty. It reveals how vulnerable populations, particularly children without wealth or social power, can be exploited when society values abstract ideals above human lives. Most importantly, it serves as a warning about the dangers of treating human beings as means rather than ends, as experimental subjects, raw material, or problems to be solved rather than individuals with inherent worth and dignity. The children of Robertson Camp deserve to be remembered, not just as victims of a particularly grotesque atrocity, but as witnesses whose stories should inform our understanding of what becomes possible when we decide that some lives matter less than others. Their silenced voices speak to us across a century, asking whether we have truly learned the lessons of their suffering or whether we remain vulnerable to the same patterns of rationalized cruelty disguised as progress. The same willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable in pursuit of some imagined better future. As you leave this dark chapter of American history, ask yourself, what similar blindness might exist in our own time? What injustices do we rationalize or ignore Because they serve interests we value or benefit systems we trust. What voices are we refusing to hear? If you found this exploration of hidden history valuable, support our continued excavation of America's buried truths. Subscribe, share this video, and join us next week as we uncover another dark chapter that powerful forces hoped would remain forgotten forever.